Hey everyone, I'm back again with another video, and this is one of the videos that I wanted to talk about for a while, and the topic at hand involves the importance of the anti-meta strategy in Yu-Gi-Oh! Really, we'll mainly be talking about the state of the anti-meta, and I've always thought the anti-meta has been a really important aspect in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's alarming that there haven't been many prominent or long-lasting anti-meta decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I'll go into some of the anti-meta decks of the past and the present, and I'll also talk about the benefits of having a strong anti-meta strategy, as well as some of the problems of not having this anti-meta scene. But without any further ado, let's get into it. So, like I said before, I've always thought the anti-meta scene is an important thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the reason why is that it provides a counterbalance to the dominant meta decks. Just like meta decks have their foothold in the tournament scene, anti-meta decks help keep the meta decks in check, and it helps prevent meta decks from becoming problematic and too overpowered. And I say this because anti-meta decks often exploit weaknesses or shortcomings of popular meta decks. These anti-meta decks tend to also have a control strategy and tend to slow things down, which is a strategy that meta decks are not usually well equipped to handle, which forces them to change their strategy, and if they don't, they risk losing the duel, and even the match may become a wash. This idea was really encompassed in YCS Niagara back in 2018, where a Time Lord duelist swept Day 2 of the Dragon Duel event, and to no surprise, many in the community were shocked to see that something as low profile as Time Lords actually made it to the modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament scene, especially since they were perceived as a non-meta deck. But this drives my point home. Time Lords have many unconventional effects like burn damage, bounce effects, and protection effects that the meta couldn't really negate. And the kicker is that these bounce and board control effects consistently took advantage away from meta decks and basically set these meta decks back pretty much every turn, and the strong protection effects allowed them to remain on the field, and they were able to finish off the opponent after delivering tons of burn damage. Time Lords had a strategy that meta decks were very ill-equipped and not prepared to handle, and other meta decks were blown out of the water because of it. More examples of fairly modern control decks are decks like Guru Control and Altergeists, where Guru Control often deployed strong flip effects to interrupt the opponent's plays, and they would often flip attacking monsters face down, which slowed the game down in a similar way to Frog Control decks, which used Totally Awesome's powerful negation effect, along with strategic trap effects to slow down and thwart your opponent's strategy, or even take advantage away from the opponent. Altergeists also functioned in a similar way since they relied on heavy trap effects to slow down the game and basically restrict your opponent's strategy. Altergeists were unbelievably effective at their craft, and they were even a tier 3 deck in the tournament scene, despite not having big beaters like Guru Control did. An interesting control deck that has seen some modern success, as well as success in the distant past, are Monarchs. And if you remember the Emperor of Darkness structure deck, it gave Monarchs a powerful resurgence in the competitive scene with powerful cards like Aether the Heavenly Monarch, Edea, Eidos, Pantheism of the Monarchs, and most importantly, Domain of the True Monarchs, which allows Monarch players to lock the opponent out from the extra deck, which then provided a great opportunity for Monarchs to pick apart the opponent with strong removal effects that cleared the board, and you could then finish off your opponent with a high attack point Monarch. And Monarch's powerful removal effects are what allowed them to find such success in the early days back in 2004. They eventually became a force in later years after monarchs like Kuraz and Caius came into the fold, which allowed them to maintain board control. So, in a way, monarchs were ahead of their time, since they very much took advantage of effects that most decks didn't have, and they often locked down the field in a unique way that took advantage away from the opponent. Either way, I personally feel Monarchs have been very influential in Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially the anti-meta strategy, and they remain one of my all-time favorite decks because they function as the great equalizer between the meta and the anti-meta strategies, and they really did feel like the deck that kept the meta under control. For this final example, we're going way back in time to some of the earliest anti-meta decks. And the most prominent early anti-meta decks were decks such as Exodia Control, Exodia Lockdown, and Solemn Judgment decks. And I would say that Exodia Control is the origin of the Altergeist strategy, where Exodia Control used tons of traps or back row to slow down the game. Traps like Sakuratsu Armor, Widespread Ruins, and Mirror Force made your opponent think twice before attacking, or often destroyed your opponent's valuable monsters, which put your opponent in a tough spot, which bought you some time to get Exodia. However, Exodia Lockdown differs in the sense that it not only slows down your opponent, but it created many barriers or restrictions on your opponent from being able to play the game through cards such as Gravity Bind, Level Limit Area B, and Messenger of Peace. And people even used Final Countdown to slowly win the game if they didn't manage to get Exodia. On top of using powerful floodgates, Exodia Lockdown also deployed powerful negation cards, such as 7 Tools of the Bandit, Magic Jammer, and Solemn Judgment. These cards were vital to protecting various floodgate cards that the deck used, as well as providing powerful ways to prevent your opponent from making crucial plays while preventing your opponent from attacking or using spells and traps. While decks like this received a lot of hatred from players, cards like Solemn Judgment were so vital to lockdown strategies that it eventually spawned its own deck that revolved around the Solemn Judgment cards. Despite these decks being very different, they did manage to force the meta to respond to them, and they made the meta have to change up their strategies so that they could work their way around the slow grind game strategies that the anti-meta decks provided. So why did I bother to go through all of these examples? I went through all of these decks because they are all examples of how they posed a threat to the meta, and how they often kept the meta in check because of their unorthodox strategies. I consider these decks as some of the best examples of providing counter strategies to the meta, which prevents one type of deck from completely overrunning the meta. And this is ultimately a benefit to Yu-Gi-Oh! Since it forces both meta players and anti-meta players to continuously evolve so that they can combat each other's strategies, which provides a sort of balance of power between the two strategies. But aside from providing balance, anti-meta decks are also beneficial to Yu-Gi-Oh! In the sense that they provide an alternative to popular meta strategies. I consider this a benefit because players are often complaining about quitting Yu-Gi-Oh! Primarily because of the overpowered, fast-paced, and spammy decks that feel like they have no player interaction. Having anti-meta decks also allows these disgruntled players to try out different sorts of strategies, which they may end up liking, and it might prevent these people from quitting Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially if these anti-meta decks are able to effectively combat the insanely powerful meta decks. However, the lack of a healthy anti-meta scene is part of the reason why we see these overpowered meta decks run rampant in tournaments, and they often seem unstoppable because they don't really have opposition to their strategies, and instead we're forced to combat other broken meta decks by creating an even stronger and more broken deck of our own, which ultimately increases the power creep, which creates a cascading problem in itself. But why is there a lack of anti-meta decks in Yu-Gi-Oh? While we don't have a definitive answer to this, I think the problem lies in the fact that there is a massive lack of support for anti-meta strategies, and most key anti-meta cards are quickly banned or limited, So, to focus on the first point, Konami doesn't really release too much support for anti-meta strategies. If we just look at Monarchs, they've sparsely received support since the late 2000s, despite them being a fan favorite deck. Part of my theory is that Konami has a history of prioritizing meta decks, and this makes sense since Yu-Gi-Oh has historically been a fast-paced game in general, and it also makes financial sense that they would continue to cater to the player audience that enjoys these incredibly fast-paced duels. However, I do think Konami has become too fixated on these fast-paced plays that they've completely overlooked how bad the power creep has actually gotten, which is why we need strong anti-meta decks. The second problem is that anti-meta cards are mostly banned or limited. The card I typically think of are cards like Vanity's Emptiness. And now I know what you're going to say. You're probably going to say it's such an oppressive card and it's such an overpowered card in general. And it may seem that way primarily because Yu-Gi-Oh has been focused around speed and meta-centric strategies. But just like we have insanely powerful cards like Halka-Fibrax, which enable rampant special summoning, I think it's important to have cards like Vanity's Emptiness to counterbalance special summon heavy strategies by throttling excessive special summoning. Cards like this could help limit the very special summon heavy combo centric decks, or even decks that take like 10-minute turns, and it may reduce the feeling of having no interaction since it allows you to interrupt your opponent. And part of the point is that it forces your opponent to interact and rethink their strategy instead of speeding their way through their long turn. That's why I think we see so many combo centric decks, or decks that basically take 10 turns to complete their combo. And it's because we don't really have equally powerful anti-meta decks that freeze special summoning, for instance. But I know what you might say. You might say that hand traps help stop combo decks, and that's not all that true, because meta decks have gotten to the point where they can easily bait or play through negations or hand traps, since they can execute 1 or 2 card combos that ultimately still let them achieve their end goal. And I think we do need cards like Vanity's Emptiness to freeze special summon heavy meta decks, so that it can force them to evolve, so that they can develop more interactive strategies. Basically, meta decks and meta players are going to have to figure out ways to destroy or remove these cards off the field, which helps promote strategy and more interactive play. So it basically changes the fixation on special summoning and it focuses on interaction instead. And you can ultimately say the same thing for cards like Royal Oppression, since it also potentially limits your special summon capabilities, and you have to think about when you need to get rid of cards like Royal Oppression in order to advance your own strategy, along with knowing when you need to use cards like Vanity's Emptiness and Royal Oppression, or even cards like Kaiser Colosseum to throttle your enemy. This also undermines the broken or unfair nature of overpowered search effects, since you're ultimately initiating searches so you can use those resources for special summoning. But again, cards like Vanity's Emptiness will force players to think about their strategies instead of just thinking about searching and special summoning. And I think this does promote more creative and interactive strategies. But in summary, I think the anti-meta scene has largely been neglected in Yu-Gi-Oh, which has allowed overpowered decks to run rampant in the meta. And I do think that this has led to some people quitting the game because these meta decks have gone out of control. And I think revitalizing the anti-meta scene is a good step to reduce the power of these overpowered meta decks. And I think having a competent and healthy anti-meta scene does provide an alternative for players who are fed up with the typical Yu-Gi-Oh meta. And I do think this alternative provides a sort of alternate format that might function similarly to a format system in games such as Magic the Gathering, or at least kind of like the standard and modern formats, or maybe at least the closest we could get to it. And I think having a strong anti-meta alternative is the closest we can currently feasibly get to an alternate format in Yu-Gi-Oh! Without having to splinter Yu-Gi-Oh! Into different formats. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on this whole topic. But like I said, this is something that I think has been lacking for a long time in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it feels like rogue decks have really been filling in the shoes for the anti-meta scene, which has been pretty hit or miss. But maybe that's a topic I'll go into for another day, since I would like to talk about different anti-meta strategies, and how they could potentially have benefits for Yu-Gi-Oh! But with that pretty much wraps up the video. If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can do so at my Necromancer1040 Patreon link down below. I normally post it in the description, and you can check it there along with the other cool things I normally post down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.